My son gave me a plastic bag with 9 crumpled dollars and told me to leave his house. It was snowing. I had no shoes, no coat. Just silence behind the door he shut in my face. I stood on the frozen steps, holding my breath, wondering if I had truly become invisible. But that night, something strange happened with those $9 and what followed after. No one in that house saw it coming. The cinnamon had burned slightly on the edge of the pan. I scraped it off with the back of a spoon and stirred the oatmeal again, hoping the smell would settle. Brendan used to love this scent when he was a boy. That was back when his world felt soft, and I still had a place in it. It was early. I always woke up before them. I liked to pretend the house belonged to me just for those quiet 30 minutes. The ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, the sound of snow melting into the kitchen window. It was a piece I borrowed without asking. I folded the napkins into triangles and set them by the mugs. Kayla preferred almond milk, so I poured a splash into her cup without touching the rest of the carton. I didn't want to give her a reason to say anything sharp again. The night before, I had noticed Brendan had moved my spare coat from the hall closet to a cardboard box near the laundry. No one said anything, just small signs that whispered louder each day. By the time Brendan came downstairs, I had already set out his vitamins and filled a bottle with lemon water. He barely looked at me. Kayla followed a few minutes later, hair tied tight, eyes on her phone. She glanced at the table, then sighed. I offered a soft smile, stepping back like a waitress would. I didn't belong in the picture anymore. I was just someone trying not to tip over the glass. Brendan finally spoke while buttering his toast. He didn't look up. He just said, real calm, that he and Kayla had been thinking, that they believed it was time for me to get back on my feet. He said I'd been with them long enough, said they needed space, said they'd even gathered a little something to help me along. He reached into a drawer and placed a plastic grocery bag on the table. It crinkled like it was embarrassed to be there. Inside were $9. 9. No coat, no shoes, no plan. They told me the buses still ran, that I could catch one if I walked 2 blocks to the main road. I stood for a moment, just looking at the bag. Then I reached for it like it was made of glass and nodded, because that was all I had left to do. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked down their steps, with snow biting at my toes through the fabric of house slippers. Funny how quiet the world feels when you realize you're no longer welcome. And if you've ever found yourself in that kind of silence, the kind that wraps around your ribs and squeezes, then you already know what I carried with me that morning. Not anger, just a kind of ending. But something else was waiting that day, and it wasn't the end they expected. The day Brendan told me to leave, the walls in that house already felt like they had pulled back. Even before his words, something in the way the light fell across the hallway had changed. Nothing in that home looked or sounded the same once I started noticing. 3 days before that morning, I walked into the laundry room and saw my sweater drawer had been emptied into a cardboard box. My winter coat, the one I had stitched back when Brendan was still in school, was folded and stuffed on top like it was just clutter to be cleared. No one told me they were moving things. No one asked if I needed them. In the evening, they no longer invited me to sit with them for shows. Instead, Kayla would close the door halfway while Brendan scrolled on his phone. I could still hear the muffled laughter, but it was never laughter meant to be shared. My chair in the living room turned into a place where unfolded laundry waited. My seat at the table became the one closest to the kitchen, not really part of the circle. Kayla began labeling things in the pantry. One afternoon, she pointed to a small sticky note and said I should not use that shelf. She had written weekly prep in blue marker. I took it as a reminder that I was temporary. She never said it out loud, but the way she looked past me in the hallway said enough. Brendan had stopped asking how my legs were healing. After the fall, he used to check every morning, handing me a cup of tea and resting his hand briefly on my shoulder. That faded quickly. These days, he barely looked up from his phone, even if I stood just a few feet away. The silence between us became its own kind of noise. It sat in the kitchen, in the spaces between the furniture, even in the corners of the bathroom where my shampoo kept being moved behind theirs. I once heard them talking late at night. Their bedroom door wasn't fully closed. Brendan said something about routines, about things being more peaceful if the house felt lighter. Kayla said she missed when it was just the two of them, that she wanted their life back. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was tired. That made it worse. Because tired people don't argue. They just decide. I started folding my clothes tighter, stacking my books near the side of the bed. I made sure not to leave dishes drying on the counter. Even the humming of the kettle felt like too much, so I stopped using it after dark. On the day before everything ended, I watched Brendan walk past me in the hallway. He had his coat on, keys in hand, ready to leave for work. I smiled. He didn't pause. He didn't nod. He just kept walking like I was part of the wall. And for a moment I thought maybe I was. There was a time when I had a place at the center of his world. Now I was something to be worked around. Quietly, politely, permanently. So when he handed me that bag with $9, it didn't come as a shock. It felt like the final step in something they had been doing piece by piece, in silence. A soft eviction, months in the making, and it was already done before I even stepped outside. The bag he handed me was the kind you get at a grocery store when you forget to bring your own. Thin plastic, stretched at the corners. It made a soft, crinkling sound when he placed it on the counter, like it didn't belong in a home, just passing through. I opened it without looking at him. There were 3 wrinkled dollar bills and a handful of change. I counted it by feel. $9 even, no envelope, no note, no coat. Kayla said they had already checked the bus schedule. I could catch the 5:40 if I walked out in the next 15 minutes. The stop was 2 blocks east, past the neighborhood playground. I looked down at my feet. House slippers, the kind you don't wear outside. No socks. The snow had started again, slow flakes, but steady, the kind that sticks. My coat was nowhere in sight. I asked if it had been packed away. Kayla walked into the hallway closet, pulled out a thin throw blanket, and handed it to me like it was a substitute. It still smelled faintly of their dog. I wrapped it around my shoulders. It didn't do much, but I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of refusing it. Brendan stood by the kitchen door, one hand on the knob. He didn't say anything else. He just held it open, waiting. Like the cold air blowing in from outside was less uncomfortable than standing in the same room with me another second. I stepped past him, holding the bag in one hand and the blanket tight with the other. The porch was slick. I moved slowly, placing my feet like a child learning to walk. My heels pressed through the soles of the slippers with each step. The sky was still dark, but the snow lit everything in a strange bluish grey, the kind of light that doesn't come from anywhere in particular, just exists all around you. The street was empty. No sounds but the shuffle of my feet and the wind catching under the edge of the blanket. I didn't look back. The houses on their block all looked the same. Well-tended lawns, wreaths on doors. But inside each one was someone waking up to coffee, maybe warmth, maybe love. I didn't have the energy to wish I was in one of them. Halfway to the bus stop, I paused near a parked car. The mirror showed a glimpse of me. A woman wrapped in fleece, clutching a plastic bag. No shoes, no plan, just $9 and the hope the bus driver wouldn't ask questions. When I reached the corner, the digital sign blinked red. Next bus in 12 minutes. I leaned against the pole and tried not to shiver. A young man passed by with his earbuds in. He glanced at me for a second, then kept walking. I wasn't anyone he needed to remember. The wind picked up. The blanket shifted. I pulled it back tighter. $9 doesn't go far, but it was something. And in that moment, it was all I had. When the bus headlights appeared down the road, I stood up straight. Not because I had to, but because I still could. The doors opened with a hiss. I stepped on board without speaking, dropped a few coins into the slot, and took a seat by the window. The city lights in the distance looked cold and unwelcoming, but they also looked like a place I hadn't yet been, and that felt, in the smallest possible way, like something close to hope. The bus pulled away with a low groan, leaving me at a corner I didn't recognize. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the blanket still clutched around me. My fingers were stiff. My breath came out in little clouds. I had no plan. Only $9, $7 now, after the bus fare. Across the street was a gas station, its lights humming weakly against the morning grey. I crossed slowly, careful not to slip. Inside, the heat hit me like a wall. The cashier didn't look up. I moved toward the small pastry case, but everything looked too sweet, too expensive. A muffin would eat up most of what I had left. I turned to leave, but then I stopped. By the register, a rack of scratch-off tickets stood next to a jar of gum. The colours were loud: reds, greens, gold foil. One of them caught my eye. $5. I stared at it for a long second. It made no sense. But something in me moved. I stepped up to the counter. He rang it up without a word. I handed him the money, took the ticket, and stepped to the side. My fingers shook as I pulled a quarter from the change left in my palm. I scratched slowly, one box at a time. My eyes didn't register what I was seeing at first. Just numbers, symbols. And then, near the bottom, a single line of black letters printed into the silver dust. Jackpot. $1 million. I stopped breathing. I looked again. My heart started to pound. Not with joy, not even with disbelief, just a kind of heavy stillness. I held it flat against the counter. The cashier noticed me now. His eyes dropped to the ticket. He blinked. He asked if I wanted him to call the number on the back. I nodded. He picked up the phone. I sat down near the bottled water display and waited. The heat of the room didn't reach me. I was somewhere else entirely. After a while, someone from the lottery office asked to speak with me. The man handed me the phone. I confirmed what he asked. I gave my name, my number. He said they would begin verification, said I would need to bring it in. But I barely heard him. When I hung up, I sat there holding the ticket with both hands. It wasn't excitement I felt. It wasn't relief. It was something quiet. A silence that wrapped around me tighter than the blanket on my shoulders. I left the gas station and stood outside in the cold again. This time it felt different. Not warmer, just less sharp. The ticket sat in my pocket, folded carefully. I didn't run. I didn't smile. I just walked. A mile or so down the road, I found a diner. I stepped inside, asked for a cup of coffee, and slid into a booth by the window. The waitress brought it without question. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth sink in. I hadn't decided what to do. I didn't think about Brendan. I didn't think about Kayla. The ticket was real. That much I knew. But I needed to breathe before I became someone else. before I stepped into whatever this new thing was. All I wanted right then was quiet, to be left alone, to sip my coffee and feel the weight of my body in the seat. The world hadn't changed, but something inside me had shifted, and I knew, without understanding why, that nothing would go back to the way it was, not even if I wanted it to. I stayed in that diner for almost 3 hours. The coffee had long gone cold, but the waitress let me sit there without pressure. She must have known something had shifted in me. I kept my coat blanket tight around my shoulders and the ticket tucked safe in my inside pocket. Every few minutes, I checked to feel it still there, like a pulse. Around noon, I stepped back out into the cold and walked 2 more blocks to the address the lottery representative had given me over the phone. It was a small regional office, wedged between a pharmacy and a shuttered fitness studio. Nothing grand, no balloons, just a glass door with a bell that jingled when I pushed it open. A woman behind a desk looked up, expression neutral. She took the ticket without surprise, placed it under a scanner, and typed something into a computer. The only sound was the tapping of her keys and the faint buzz of a fluorescent light overhead. After a minute, she nodded slowly. She asked for my identification. I gave her the only one I had, a worn-out card that still listed my old address, the one from before Brendan moved me in. She checked it, photocopied it, then handed it back. Then she offered me a seat and brought over a cup of tea. Not in a paper cup, but a real ceramic mug. It was chipped near the handle. I appreciated that. It meant someone had used it before me. She told me the money wouldn't come all at once, that they'd arrange the payout in a lump sum after taxes, or over time, depending on what I chose. She spoke carefully, like someone trained to talk to people in shock. I nodded, but I wasn't really following her words. The tea was peppermint. I hadn't tasted anything warm and quiet like that in weeks. I held it close to my mouth and just breathed. She gave me a folder with paperwork to read later. She also gave me a business card with her name, printed in blue ink. Her name was Delia. That was the first human detail I allowed myself to remember that day. Before I left, Delia placed the ticket into an envelope marked with a tracking number. She told me again that it was valid, that I would be hearing from their office by the end of the week. I walked out feeling like I had handed over a piece of myself. Not because of the ticket, but because that moment meant something was officially changing. It had gone from surreal to real, from what if to now what. Outside, the air felt heavy with late snow. The wind pressed against my cheeks as I crossed the street, but I didn't feel it the same way I had that morning. I found a small bench by the pharmacy window and sat down. The envelope was warm from Delia's hand. I held it in mine and looked out at the slow traffic moving past. For the first time in years, I had no one to tell, no phone call to make, no son to share the news with. And yet, I felt no urge to speak. There was no list of people I wanted to prove wrong, no need to show up at a doorstep. What I felt was a quiet space opening up inside me. Not joy, not sorrow, just stillness. I had spent so long being useful, so long trying not to be a burden, so long tucking myself into corners and waiting for permission. Now, there was nothing to wait for. That night, I paid for a room at a small motel near the edge of town. The clerk gave me a key without asking questions. I turned on the heat, folded the blanket across the foot of the bed, and sat for a long time in the armchair by the window. Outside, the snow began again, steady, soft, uncaring. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there with the envelope on the nightstand and my hands folded in my lap. That moment, more than the money, was the beginning of everything else. The room was plain, wallpaper peeled slightly near the baseboards. A small television sat on a dresser, its remote missing the back cover. But it was warm. The heater rattled like an old dog settling into sleep, steady and predictable. I liked that. The first night, I didn't sleep much, not from worry, just from the strangeness of silence that didn't come with expectation. No footsteps overhead, no dishwasher clinking, no distant voices deciding whether I belonged. Morning came with grey skies and a knock on the door. I opened it slowly. No one there, just the sound of the vending machine humming near the stairwell. I stepped outside and breathed the cold. Back inside, I made myself tea with the motel's dusty kettle and turned on the TV to hear another human voice. It was a talk show, something about a dog who saved its owner from a fire. I let it run in the background. I pulled out the folder Delia had given me. Inside were documents and options, lump sum or yearly payouts, legal resources, tax guidance. It all looked official, cold and unfamiliar. I didn't read most of it that day. Instead, I took out a notepad from the drawer and began making lists. Not of things to buy, not of ways to spend the money, but names. Names of people I remembered from a time before I became invisible. A nurse from the memory care wing I worked with. A janitor who stayed late on weekends just to clean the kitchen floors. A girl from church who used to bring her grandmother's soup every Sunday after choir. They weren't friends exactly, but they were good people. People who showed up. The idea came slowly. Then it sharpened. I didn't want to waste this change on things. I wanted to shift something permanent. I made another list. Shelters, cold weather programs. I looked up which ones were still running and which had closed during the last harsh winter. One in particular had shut down the year before after losing funding. A temporary overnight centre near the train station. I remembered hearing about it in passing. A man froze to death on the steps after finding the doors locked. That image stayed with me. So I made a call. The woman on the other end was polite but cautious. I told her I wanted to offer help. Not in my name, but as a private contribution. Quiet and clean. I didn't explain more than that. She said they always needed socks, gloves, thermals, especially in the storm weeks. She gave me a contact at their distribution site. His name was Richard. He answered on the second ring and didn't ask questions. He just told me where the need was greatest. That night, I ordered crates of supplies to be delivered. Socks in packs of 10, blankets in bulk, heat packs by the hundreds. And then I signed the order under a new name, Brendan Donnelly, not to spite him, but to give the world a name to thank, one that would follow him whether he wanted it or not. He would see it, hear it, be congratulated, and he would have to carry that quiet, heavy truth. It was never his. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I didn't announce it. I didn't want gratitude. I wanted distance. But I knew, in the soft way a person knows when they're doing something right, that this was how I would begin again. Not by proving a point, but by planting something no one could uproot. By the end of that week, the first shipment arrived at the shelter's back door. No ceremony, just 2 trucks pulling up on a Tuesday morning. Richard texted me to say they'd come. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The order slip listed the sender as Brendan Donnelly. No return address, no note. The shelter posted about it the next day on their small public page. A photo showed a few volunteers stacking boxes. The caption thanked Brendan Donnelly for the unexpected donation that would help keep hundreds warm through the winter storm forecasted that weekend. I sat in the motel armchair and stared at the screen. I imagined Brendan sitting somewhere, maybe at his office desk or their kitchen counter, opening a message from a distant relative or a co-worker who had seen the post. Maybe someone said they hadn't realized he was involved in charity. Maybe someone asked if it was his foundation. He would have to answer, or avoid it. Either way, the name had already taken a new shape in the world. Not as a man who closed the door on his mother, but as a man who gave warmth to strangers. And he would know that every box, every blanket, every soft, quiet thank you whispered into cold air. It was never his doing, it was mine. I ordered more, not just for shelters, but for small food pantries, drop-in centers, mobile outreach teams, always under his name, always without contact info. Each order came with a printed line, in honor of Brendan Donnelly's continued support. I began hearing the name in strange places, on a community radio segment, in a local article shared by someone at the diner. I said nothing, just sipped my tea and listened. No one connected it to me. That was the point. But then, one morning, something shifted. I walked past the front desk at the motel, and the clerk waved me over. She said a package had come in with my name. I hadn't ordered anything for myself, so I hesitated. The box was small. Inside was a handwritten letter. It came from a woman named Meredith. She ran a senior program on the South Side. She had received one of the anonymous donations and somehow tracked the shipment to a warehouse I had used. The name Brendan Donnelly stood out. She looked him up and saw that he had no known affiliation with any outreach work. She didn't accuse. She simply wrote that, whatever the story was, she hoped the person behind the gift knew they had made a difference. She said the way people lit up at receiving something as simple as new socks was something she hadn't seen in years. She thanked him. And then she thanked the real person too, just in case he wasn't the one. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. That afternoon, I walked into town. The snow had started again, softer this time. I passed by the pharmacy window and caught my reflection. A woman in plain clothes, face weathered but steady. I studied her. She wasn't the version Brendan had pushed out of his house. She wasn't the woman huddled on a bus stop bench. She was something in between, still forming. I stepped into a thrift store near the corner and bought a coat, a real one, thick wool, with deep pockets and a working zipper. I left the blanket folded on the motel bed when I returned. The slippers went in the trash. That evening I walked through the town square. A child pointed to a flyer on a board. A winter drive sponsored by Brendan Donnelly, it said. His name was everywhere now, but none of it belonged to him. And that was the part that made the wind feel less cruel on my cheeks. The next week, I moved out of the motel. There was no drama in the checkout. I folded the blankets, left the room cleaner than I had found it, and slipped a thank you note under the front desk bell. The clerk didn't know what I'd been doing from that room. I liked it that way. I rented a small unit in a quiet building at the edge of town. Nothing fancy. One bedroom, creaky floors, a radiator that worked when it felt like it. But there was a little kitchen, and the window faced the east, which meant I could see the sun break through the sky each morning. That mattered more than I thought it would. Each day settled into a rhythm. I woke up early, made tea, and worked through lists of shelters and outreach centers. The orders grew, not just winter supplies now. Some places needed bus vouchers, warm meals, childcare kits for women in crisis. I spoke to volunteers across counties, always with a calm voice and a clear request. Each donation still carried the name Brendan Donnelly. No one questioned it. The name began to carry weight. I saw it mentioned in newsletters, listed on banners at donation sites, spoken out loud by people who had no idea where it really came from. But word spreads fast in places built on quiet kindness. And then it happened. I was walking through the Central Plaza on a Saturday, when I saw a sign outside the community hall. They were organizing a thank you luncheon for local donors. Names were printed on a poster board next to the door. His was first, sponsored by Brendan Donnelly. My breath caught for a second, not from fear, but from the strange sensation of seeing my son's name held up by people who had no idea what he had truly done. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I stood for a moment, just outside the glass doors, and watched people gather. Laughter, handshakes, the smell of soup and bread drifting out when the door swung open. Then I saw him. Brendan. He was standing near the back wall, stiff in posture, clearly uncomfortable. He wasn't shaking hands. He wasn't smiling. Someone must have told him about the event. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe one of the thank you letters got forwarded by accident. He stood there alone, looking at the display table that carried his name. He didn't know what to do with it. I stepped back into the shade, far enough not to be noticed. He scanned the room once, twice, then turned and left. He didn't take anything, didn't talk to anyone, just slipped out through the side door like a man who walked into a story he didn't recognize. I stayed behind the glass. I didn't feel triumph, not even satisfaction. What I felt was the stillness of a lesson unfolding, not a punishment, a reflection. Brendan had always needed the world to see him a certain way, clean, capable, above struggle. But now he was attached to the very places and people he once looked down on, and the only way to escape it was to tell the truth, a truth that would only shame him more. He had been given a reputation he didn't earn, and he couldn't carry the weight of it. Meanwhile, I had no name in that room, no title on a board, no applause, but I had peace. I turned away and walked down the sidewalk, the wind soft against my cheek. I passed a group of volunteers handing out warm bags of food. One of them called out his name in thanks to the air. I didn't stop walking, but I did let the corners of my mouth lift. Not in pride, in clarity, because sometimes justice doesn't need to be loud, it only needs to be seen. The letter arrived folded in thirds, addressed by hand, no return address. But the handwriting was unmistakable. Brendan's. The same slanted capital letters I remembered from his schoolwork, pressed too hard into the paper. I opened it without urgency. Inside, only a few lines. He wanted to talk, said he had questions, mentioned the shelter events, the posts online, the community flyers with his name, said someone had thanked him at his office. He claimed confusion. Then he asked if I was well. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he had done. Just confusion wrapped in a thin layer of politeness. I folded the letter back into the envelope and placed it on the windowsill. It stayed there for 2 days. On the third, I called the number he had written. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was flat, unsure. He asked if we could meet. We agreed on a diner, a different one than before, closer to his side of town. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose the booth farthest from the window. When he walked in, his coat looked expensive, his shoes shined, but his eyes were tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He sat down without touching the menu. He kept glancing at the server, as if afraid someone would recognize him. I let him speak first. He danced around it, said people were sending letters, donations in his name, asking about his foundation. He didn't understand where it came from, said it felt like a mistake or a prank. Then he paused. He looked at me and asked if I had anything to do with it. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him shift in his seat. Then I said it wasn't a mistake. He blinked, looked away, picked at the edge of a napkin. He asked why. but his voice was smaller now. I told him I didn't do it to ruin him. I told him I didn't need revenge. What I needed was to turn his name into something that actually helped someone. And if that brought him discomfort, maybe it was the kind that taught instead of punished. He didn't speak for a while. When he did, his voice was almost a whisper. He said Kayla had left 2 weeks ago, said she packed up and went to stay with her sister, said things had been strained, that the pressure of pretending had worn thin. He admitted he had lied about some things, that kicking me out wasn't just about space or routine, it was about shame. He said he didn't know what to do with someone like me anymore, someone who reminded him of where he came from. The words hung in the air like steam over cold coffee. I didn't respond with comfort. I didn't reach across the table. I just listened. He said he didn't want the name anymore, said the weight of it was wrong now, that every time he heard someone say thank you, he felt like a fraud. I told him he could try to give it back, but he couldn't take it from the people who now trusted it. It wasn't his to reclaim. He looked older than he had a year ago, not from time, from consequence. When the check came, I paid it, quietly. He didn't argue. Outside, the air had warmed. Snow was melting in the gutters. He walked me to the corner, hands in his coat pockets. He didn't ask to visit, didn't offer a ride, just stood there, watching me go. And I walked away, knowing I hadn't won anything. But I had finished something only I could write, and the world had already read it in his name. I didn't see Brendan again after that diner meeting. His name continued to appear on flyers, newsletters, donation banners, but his face disappeared from the places that celebrated it. Whatever discomfort he had carried, it grew too large to hide behind polite smiles. I didn't send more supplies in his name after that. The work didn't stop. It simply changed hands. I started using other names. Sometimes the name of a woman I used to work with in the laundry unit. Sometimes just initials. The shelters didn't care. What mattered was that the coats were warm and the food arrived on time. At night, I began writing again. Not for anyone else to read, just to clear space in my mind. I wrote about the weight of doorways, the way silence changes shape in a home, the difference between being alone and being unseen. The words came slowly, but they stayed. One morning, I received a letter from a shelter I had supported anonymously. They had hosted a small ceremony and wanted to acknowledge the donors who had kept their services running through the hard months. Inside the envelope was a photo of the wall they had created, painted with the names of contributors. I searched for Brendan's. It wasn't there. Instead, I saw a line in smaller lettering, in memory of those whose names were never spoken, but whose hands built warmth. That line stayed with me. I started walking more. Around the lake near the edge of town, through the open-air farmers' market. I didn't talk much, but I watched. I listened. And I noticed how often people offered small kindnesses when they thought no one would see. One afternoon, I passed a schoolyard where children were gathering food donations in plastic bins. A teacher was reading out the list of community supporters. The children clapped politely at each name. But when she read mine, I didn't react. Because it wasn't my name. It was just a line that said, "Supported by one who understands the cold." I stopped for a second, not out of pride, but because something loosened in my chest. That line was more accurate than any name they could have printed. I did understand the cold. I had lived in it, not just outside in the snow, but in the places where warmth should have lived and didn't. Back home, I pinned that photo to my kitchen wall, not in the center, just off to the side, where my eyes could land when the kettle boiled or when I reached for a mug. I made peace with what I had done. Not because it balanced the scale, but because it built something new. A name does not make a person. A name can be borrowed, mistaken, erased. But the effect of what a person does, that stays. Brendan would go on. Maybe he would rebuild his life. Maybe not. That was no longer part of my concern. I had handed him a mirror. What he saw in it was up to him. And as for me, I had returned to myself. Not the version they had kept out of holiday dinners or shuffled to the corner of birthday photos, but the version that remembered her own full weight, even when no one else did. Some people walk away from family and never look back. Others rebuild from a distance. I chose neither. I simply stopped waiting to be invited in. And that changed everything. The days began to stretch longer. Spring crept in slow, pushing back the cold one gentle breath at a time. I didn't rush it. I let it come the way healing does, not with a bang, but with soft persistence. The apartment grew quieter, not because it lacked sound, but because I no longer filled it with noise to cover silence. The television stayed off most mornings. Instead, I listened to the hum of the radiator, the rustle of the trees outside, the kettle building toward a boil. Peace had a shape, and I had learned to sit inside it. I visited the library more often, not to speak with anyone, but to feel the nearness of words. I read about landscapes I would never visit and people I would never meet. Their struggles were not mine, but their endurance felt familiar. Some of the staff began to recognize me, nodding when I passed through the aisles. No one asked for my story. That was its own kind of gift. Occasionally, I received letters from shelters still distributing supplies. They wrote about the people they served. A mother with 2 children who slept through the storm in a cot near the heater. An elderly man who cried after being given clean socks. These notes never mentioned my name. They didn't need to. One afternoon, as I passed through the park near the south end of town, I came across a bench with a small brass plaque. I almost missed it, but the sunlight caught its edge just enough to draw my eyes. It read, "In honor of those who gave without needing applause." I sat down, not because I was tired, but because the words asked me to stay a while. Around me, the city moved. Children played near the fountain. A man jogged past with his dog. Somewhere nearby, a street musician tuned a guitar. It was all so ordinary. And still, I felt something settle inside me like a stone finding its place. I thought about Brendan, not with bitterness, not even with longing, just with the soft recognition that we had travelled to the far ends of each other and survived the journey. He had made his choices, and I had made mine, and I had stopped trying to meet him in the middle. I now lived in a space that didn't require permission, not from a son, not from a name, not from a past that used to define me. I had begun again, quietly, thoroughly, and not in the shadow of anyone else's idea of who I was meant to be. As the sun dipped lower, I stood up and placed my palm on the edge of the plaque. It was warm from the day's light. I walked home slowly, carrying nothing more than the weight of myself. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. There was a calmness that came with not needing to be seen, a softness in being allowed to exist without performance. I had lived through the version of life that begged for acknowledgement, for a seat at the table, for someone to remember I was still in the room. Now, I lived differently. I made breakfast slowly. I folded towels with care. I walked past mirrors without flinching. Nothing about me had changed on the outside, but the silence inside me had taken on a new shape, one not filled with sorrow, but with balance. Some days I still caught glimpses of Brendan's world. A co-worker of his had written a public article praising the man's charitable impact. His name came up in City Hall minutes. It echoed through community circles like a ghost story with no ending. I never corrected it, not because I lacked the courage, but because the truth had already done its work. There was power in letting someone carry a version of themselves they could no longer outrun. Brendan knew what he had done. He knew where it had led, and I had no interest in continuing the conversation. My focus was on something quieter now. I began writing notes to women I once worked alongside, women who were overlooked the way I had been, women who bent over trays, wiped counters clean, kept hallways warm for others, while no one remembered their birthdays. I sent them gift cards tucked in blank envelopes, sometimes just a scarf, sometimes nothing more than a line that read, "I saw how hard you worked." No one wrote back. They weren't meant to. The world had always measured women like me by how much we endured without complaint. I no longer found pride in being resilient. I found it in choosing softness, in refusing to prove myself anymore, in making peace with the small, unglamorous power of walking away without explanation. The lottery money was never the point. It was just the first doorway. The real win came in knowing I didn't owe anyone a version of myself that kept shrinking to fit their expectations. That kind of freedom is quiet. No headlines, no applause, just breath, space, a bed that feels like safety instead of exile. I sometimes think back to that moment in the snow. Bare feet, $9. My hands shaking as I stood outside the house I helped build. I remember the silence behind the door that closed. And I thank that moment, not because it was kind, but because it finally gave me permission to stop asking for what I had already given myself. My name may never show up in the places his does, but that doesn't mean I was erased. It means I chose which weight to carry and which to leave behind for good. If this story stirred something in you, take a quiet moment tonight. Think about the doors that closed on you and the ones you opened for yourself. You don't need a name on a wall to matter. You don't need permission to begin again. If you've ever felt invisible, know this: you're not alone, and your story isn't over. Share your thoughts below if you'd like. Someone out there might need to hear them too.